Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to welcome everybody to our webinar today on how to write and publish a case study. We're very excited to have you here with us. Just to get started with a few housekeeping things. First, I want you to make sure that you keep your mics and cameras off during the presentation. In terms of Q&A, we've reserved a lot of time for that, about 30 minutes at the end. So please add your questions to the chat throughout the presentation. In terms of structure, we're just going to do a brief introduction to get started. We're going to look at kind of the background of how you develop the case in terms of the idea, the narrative, looking at teaching it and the teaching note, and then ISM's role in terms of support and publishing. First, to get started with how this came about, our speakers today are going to be Will Fawcett, who is an ISM DBA candidate, Dr. Sorry. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Dr. Andrew Thomas, who's a member of ISM's core faculty, and of course our Dean Cesar Baena. And our three speakers today actually collaborated on a case, Rebuilding Ground Zero. I'm sure some of you have heard, many of you have heard about that because we did publicize it, about Will's experience during the negotiations for the settlement of the insurance claim around the World Trade Center. And the case recently won an award in the North America Business Awards. So we're very excited to have them with us today, kind of sharing their background and expertise and how everything came about and how you can do the same and also learn how to create one of these teaching tools. So I'm going to hand it over right now to Will to get started, just giving us a little bit of background.
Thanks, Carla. I'm watching some of the chats come in. It's nice to see so many of you and from all over the world. Like many great things, they start with something simple. In our case, when we were writing the World Trade Center story, I was in class with Andrew. He was my professor, and we did our introductions and told a little bit about ourselves. And then one of the things I mentioned during class was that I'd worked on this World Trade Center claim. And over the course of the next couple of days, Andrew and I started chatting at breaks and talking about things where we were mutually connected. I think the first thing that stuck in my mind was that we were both Gulf War veterans. And so it was easy to start the process. And at this time, no one was thinking about doing a case study, but that's how it starts with, what are the experiences that we had, and we start talking about it. And then what happened was the idea or the story, the interesting event turns into something that's more viable and becomes a case study. And so let me I know we're going a little out of turn, but Andrew, maybe you could say a little bit about what piqued your interest when we were first talking in class.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Again, as we all know, having either taught or participated as students in an ISM seminar, MBA, EMBA, DBA, PhD, they're incredibly rich experiences because we have so many interesting people from so many parts of the world in the room. And I think when we do the introductions, it's the first day, it's kind of overwhelming. I know it is from a faculty perspective. You got so many remarkable people there. And at the same time, you're also thinking about delivering the content. And I've taught for 13 years at ISM, and I've heard so many student introductions. One thing that really piqued me about Will initially was, and he mentioned, of course, his military background. He also mentioned in his introduction that he was involved in the 9/11 case. from a very different perspective. I of course, was involved in writing about 9/11. I was writing about aviation security prior to 9/11. I testified before Congress and 9/11 Commission. So I guess Will had me at 9/11, if you want to use that cliche. And then over time, really at the breaks, we talked about our individual experiences, military and otherwise. I was really, though, curious more about the story about 9/11. From the insurance, from the risk perspective, from something I didn't know anything about regarding that topic, and I was just really compelled by everything that he said, and I think that was kind of that organic beginning, which really I think speaks to the fact that again, I can say this as a faculty member, we have such remarkable people in these classes sitting in front of us. Sometimes it's good to just listen to what they say, kind of process it, and not be thinking about the beginning of the PowerPoint presentation we're going to give once the introductions are finished, because you miss that. Again, it doesn't happen often in the world when you have so many people in one place from such divergent backgrounds that we miss potential opportunities like this one. And I'm really happy with myself and Will and Cesar that we saw this in that few days that we were together, that this could be something far greater than any of us individually.
Yeah, it really was something interesting. And I had never published a case study before. I'd never even thought about a case study. Certainly we all used them in class, but as I started talking with Andrew over the next couple of days, and then we looped Cesar in and we started talking about this, it seemed as though this might have some potential to be turned into a case study. So at that point, the first step was, I wrote down the story about, what was happening to me during 9/11, and we developed the story kind of at first chronologically, but then there had to be a twist on it. Why is this interesting? Maybe people have heard about 9/11, but they didn't know about what was happening in the background. And the basis of our story was the day that the day that the Twin Towers came down, no insurance policy had been issued. And this caused a lot of, this causes a problem. So now what do? You're expecting that insurance will pay for this. There was no insurance policy in place, even though it had been promised. And now everybody finds themselves in a very difficult position, which becomes more and more complex in light of, a national tragedy. Carl, if you could advance one slide. So what we did was we started writing, and I was telling my story. But what came out of this was, after we had talked about, what do we want to use this for? Okay, it's a case study, and where will we take? There was a lot of discussion around, what kind of classes will we teach it in? And then what's going to be interesting to them? So for us, the compelling angle was that there was no insurance policy, and that people from around the world, different countries, were all facing this major financial crisis. And then we started working on it. There were several times when Cesar and Andrew and I would get together and talk on the phone or hash ideas, usually when I was back in Paris. And maybe one of the others of you want to talk about how we didn't have the initial idea A to Z at the beginning, but it sort of evolved.
Yeah, I mean, I can I add something just quickly before you go on? Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, I thought it was extremely interesting, your experience. And of course, being the dean of the business school, that, we try to document so many remarkable stories that people have, actually. And everybody have heard about 9/11, but, what that experience says, that even there is a case in which people talk about, and it's in the media, and it's a major world event, there is always a side that should be shared. There is always something that you can actually discover. And this is what we found in Will's story, which was so compelling that, and we thought that we have to share it with the community. And of course, case studies are to be used like in the class setting, but also beyond. People can use that for other purposes, but basically within a business school is within the class setting. And we shared many things. Of course, I didn't share with you the military background, but of course the interest in knowing more about what happened on one side of the story. So go on.
Yeah, thanks, Cesar. I think, it's important because there was at least enough of a hook there. And as you said at the beginning, there are a lot of, or Andrew had said at the beginning, there are a lot of students at ISM that have deep experiences that are really interesting, but they're not being told.
Sure.
And so once Cesar and Andrew had said this could make a good idea, then we started developing the narrative around it and telling the story. And as we were working on it together, we found out, gosh, this needs to be clarified. And at first, I was talking about insurance because I'm an insurance guy, and I was, at an insurance company when this happened. But that was not interesting or compelling to anybody except, me. So we started breaking out the story, and making it clear for people. Then we started developing exhibits so that you would have something. If you found that the story wasn't making sense somewhere, then we either added to it or we added an exhibit. And always it was that we were telling the story from my perspective, and then also from the perspectives of the other people, so that you set up the problem, and then it puts it in a position where students can solve the problem. And there are lots of ways you can do it. I think a good story is one that the outcome could be a lot of different things, and it's not obvious at the beginning. And Carla, could you advance one more slide, please?
Could I make one comment here at this point in terms of talking about as the process is unfolding? For those of us who maybe have done a case study before, I'd done a couple. I was aware. I don't think Will was at all. Cesar, I'm sure, was that these are not easy to do, and they're not quickly done. If you want to do a case study, in fact, I think I mentioned to Will a couple of times. He was a little bit shocked by the nature of the academic world, that this is probably going to take 2.5 years. And not to toot my own horn, but I was pretty much right on that one. So I think one of the underlying reasons for the success of any publishing venture, particularly in academia, because it takes so long, is that you have to have a mutual interest in the topic and the idea. That passion not been there in terms of trying to learn more about 9/11, and just having a personal stake, maybe even a prurient interest, if I can use that term, to learn more about this. I think things can break down. You can get a third or a half away into a project like this, and then as you're going through iterations, because I can't count and remember exactly the number of iterations we had on this, but it was multiple. It was probably more than 10. And of course, you're tweaking the narrative, and we're trying to position this properly. All the things that have to happen to get a publication, but particularly a quality one. So I would just add, as we're going through this, to think about the fact that as we were running up against all of these issues, which are very normal, the driving force was, again, the passion around the topic. So, to kind of go back to that initial conversation that Will and I had in February in the classroom in Paris, I was immediately attracted to the fact that I was going to learn something about a topic I was already very interested in. Of course, he was very interested in this because of his personal involvement. We brought Cesar in, and Cesar was interested in 9/11. So that enabled us to work through this over that multi-year period. And I think that's something that's fundamental to success in any endeavor, particularly in something like, we're not, I have not seen Will in person since, and Cesar I saw, I think, once pre-COVID. So we're doing this virtually, and you have to have that passion there that keeps the glue together.
Yeah, and I would add something that case studies should be used in different settings, in classroom settings for different courses, and that's one of the requirements of the publishing house, if we can say that. We'll get into that later on, but basically a case like that could be used in an international law course, international business, negotiation, strategic management, like the one that I used for the case. So sometimes in the process of writing, and this iterative process, there are some times where Will would write something from his law background that would sort of require more clarifications from a layman, from a different perspective, because it was obvious to the writer, but perhaps not to a wider audience, right? So those are the things that are important to keep in mind when writing a case study, that they're going to be used in different class settings and going to be read and discussed by people with different backgrounds.
Yeah, it's a great point. We didn't start out knowing what we were going to teach this class or how we would use the case study or others would use it. So part of the process was kind of making it appealable to a wide audience of students, and also a wide range of classes that it could be used in. So it wasn't 2 years of, well, we're waiting for the publisher. It was 2 years of let's make this better. Let's add things to it. And where we started and where we ended up were very different. I mean, we always had the idea, and Andrew and Cesar were helping me walk through the idea, but it really went from a story that might appeal to a couple of us to one that could be used in a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different classes for teaching. And that's probably a good segue into one of the requirements for a case study, the teaching note.
I'll add something about the teaching note, and then we can sort of discuss it all together. Well, teaching notes are very important because it's sort of like, it's about sharing the experience of having used the case, right? For instance, the case center where we publish the case requires that we use the case in 3 different classes, right? Different levels, right? But the teaching note is something which is mandatory, and to a large extent, some cases do not have a teaching note, but those are the ones that are least popular, because if we look at the stats, the ones that are getting sold and the ones that are more like sought after are the ones that have a teaching note. Of course, the teaching note can be adapted, depending on the audience and on the experience as well of the professor. But basically, the teaching note should start with a synopsis, right? Of what is the context? Why are you going to be using that case? What is the importance of it? What can actually that bring to the audience, right? And then the target group is going to be undergrad, postgrad, executives, basically the target audience that you're going to be using it for. The learning objectives and the key issues, basically what are people going to get out of using that case, whether it's going to be negotiation in our case, or strategic management, or international relations, international business, so a case like that could be actually used in different settings, but highlighting what are people that are going to be using it in the class setting going to get out of it. Carla, can you please go down to the next one? The teaching strategy, basically, how are you going to be using that? You start with some questions to spark the discussion, right? You're going to divide up the group in different small groups. How many? It's basically using the experience of the people that have used the case before. The learning method is going to be perhaps using some sort of multimedia support. Is going to be using the Blackboard, whatever was used in the class, and based on the experience of the person that used it. The teaching style, because some professors, when they use it, they tend to be very interactive. Of course, this is the idea with using a case study, that you have to be interactive and get feedback from the students as in real time as you are using the case, right? But there are some other approaches when professors use perhaps a theoretical background, and then they bring in the case, etc. It's more about sharing your teaching style and how it actually played out during the experience of teaching the case. Then questions for discussion. Always, you can have a key set of questions, but always with the backup questions in case the discussion sort of like draws down, and then the energy to energize more, so you have key questions and then sub questions, the ones that you used, and of course these are updated as the case is being used in different settings and different courses. Carla, please, the following one.
Yeah.
Carla, can we see the next?
Yes, it's on the next.
Oh, right. Okay. The background reading, of course, I mean, if you're, okay, yeah, sure. That's good. Thanks. The background reading, if you're going to provide something in our case, I think there were not too many things that we provided, but perhaps in my class, the one that I used it for was more about strategic management or corporate strategy, right? Or sometimes that we can provide some sort of chronology or some sort of data, right? Quantitative or qualitative analysis of the data, because sometimes you have to be crunching some numbers, you have to be using numbers and dates, whatever, how anything that could help the professor deal with that, in terms of the case and how students are going to be processing this data. But also that depends on the case. I don't think in our case there was too much data quantitative, but in other cases there are, right? So it depends on the case and the nature of it. Can we see the next one, please, Carla? I think that's going to be the last one concerning the teaching note. Right, and the experience of using the case, the time that it actually took, that is quite important, because people want to know exactly how much it took them to use the case. It could be 3 hours, it could be taught perhaps in 2 sessions. The course, the whole, there could be a course of 3 hours, but then you're going to be using the case for the, half last period of the class, and then you can break up the groups, and then for the discussion it would take half an hour. It's whatever your experience was in terms of the time frame for using the case is extremely useful for upcoming professors to use it. There is a lot of multimedia background and support that you can use, but this in our case that was not really the case. One interesting thing that we used here in my class, actually there was Will, and this is quite funny. We did a negotiation using the case, but we never told people that Will was in the class. So he was actually playing, anonymous, with nobody knew his identity, right? So he was like another student. That was quite fun, because at the end, of course, people negotiated, and then they came up with their approaches and solutions to the negotiation problem. And then at the very end, we told Will, what happened, and then he told the class what had happened, etc. And that's one of the key things that people might want to see is, I mean, students are always asking, well, what happened at the end, and then not even sometimes right after, but, a few years down the road. So if you can get information, sort of update the case with some recent information, that is very useful. Another thing from experience of having written and used case studies before is like, okay, students might say, well, this case is perhaps 5 years old or 10 years old or something, but, and you have to have that information to say, what happened after the case was written up until now, because students, they actually want to know about that. Right? It wasn't the case here because, of course, the information was there, and we can provide it, on the spot, as Will was there at the time that we used that, right? And how the case is going to be used. Basically, the teaching note. This is what it's going to be used for, and I encourage people when they write a case study, they must do a teaching note, even though at the end of the day, what I used to do is that I look at a teaching note from a case and then I adapt it to my setting or to my experience. But it is an extremely useful reference for professors who are using the teaching note. Thank you. Can we go on to the next? Maybe, I think it's more about sharing. The publishing and then ISM role in this. Well, from the beginning, and this is what was part of the interest in participating in this project with Will and Andrew, was that this case is going to be like the first of a series. We already said that we have remarkable people with remarkable experience, only seeking to sort of share those experiences, right? So we need this combination, this interactive project between faculty and students. Students that have an idea, but they don't know how to translate it into something like a case study. And then the faculty that is actually, promoting the idea of using case studies and using the experience, helping students, bring this into a structure like the case study, and be able to share it with the ISM community and beyond. Because of course, when we publish something in the Case Center, which was our publishing house, we can say that it is bought and it's accessible worldwide, to different audiences, right? Different universities, different business schools. So this is a great tool, not only to share our experiences, but sort of like get our word and our work out there. Not even not just from, it is, it's been born in the ISM community, but the target is actually a global target. Andrew, maybe you want to say something about the publishing process, because I know we sort of targeted one publisher before, and the subject didn't fit their requirements. So this is actually part of the process until we actually found the one that was that fit the nature of the case study. Maybe you would like to add something about that?
Yeah, a couple things I think that are relevant to what the question that Cesar brought up are. First of all, and this is another benefit, immense benefit, that working with ISM, again, students, faculty, administration, all of us in the community have that really helps, I think, this process, is we were able to test this case in a number of settings, in a number of scenarios, a lot easier than if we weren't affiliated with ISM. And what do I mean? Well, clearly, Will, legal, insurance, risk background. We kind of had figured out at the beginning of the process that was not going to be appealing to a wider audience. And of course, you have to massage Will's ego a little bit. Now, he's a good guy, so it didn't take much. The way I was able, at least, to convince him, I think, finally, that we were going to have to move out of his comfort zone was I tested this in one of my executive MBA classes at the University of Akron, where I'm also a tenured faculty member, my full-time job. And I communicated back the results from that audience. And these people it's a general executive MBA, similar to the EMBA at ISM, same kind of level of student. And it became abundantly clear that if this was more a generalist perspective, meaning we were looking at things like international negotiations, a broader topic that could be applicable in a lot of situations, that then we could really kind of craft the case at that point to that wider space. And that's what we began to do. So when the case was tested, if you will, or test marketed, it was done in a wide variety of classes using ISM at that point. Whether it was in the Friday-Saturday ISEG course, I know that Will taught the strategic management one. I think that Cesar taught, and then Will, of course, in his other classes as well. So we had a wide range of testing that was done to see that we were kind of on the right track. And how did we get to that point to decide? I just kind of took a unilateral decision and said, I'm going to try this out in my EMBA class, because somebody's got to make a decision. And I think that's part of it here, is that eventually you have to take the leap of faith. And that's really what it is, to say, okay, we have this compelling narrative. Now let's take it to the next level and really see if it's going to fly in a real world setting. And so we did that, and that was a year and a half in. So we had started this in February. The following October, so about 18 months later, is when I introduced it to that executive MBA program. So that 18 months that we were working on this thing, iteration after iteration after iteration, developing the narrative, we kind of came to that point. And once we had done that, a year and a half in, that next year was really about refining what we had put together in the previous year and a half. And I can't say how, I guess I can't stress how important that next year was to getting this to a point where we could then position it. First, we went to Ivy at Western Ontario. It was a long shot, always shoot high, I believe. And they told us only their faculty write cases. And I figured that'd be the case. So then we went to the Case Center, which seemed much more logical for us as an outlet.
Right.
And we were able to align, because now we had all this data from the testing we had done over the past year. We could align what we had done with what they were asking for in terms of the publication of the case. So that's why I think one of the questions on the chat was, what did this take 2.5 years? It really was 1.5 years to get it deliverable and to execute it in the classroom. And then it was another year to make it and create information around it and learning around it, that we could then craft the submission of the case to the case center based upon the fact that we had done all of this over the previous 12 months.
Yeah. It's a good point about this taking a while. Now, part of the delay or the time that it required before we could teach the case was partially because of my job and what was going on, and I didn't have a lot of time to do it, and I think I underestimated the amount of time. But once we started rolling on the cases, we taught this 6 or 7 times before we submitted to the publisher. And every time we had a different outcome. Every time we learned something new from the students that really makes this good. And you'll be very interested to see what happens when your story starts being debated in class. You get a perspective that you wouldn't normally have. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why they require the teaching, why they have the teaching requirement, because you find out whether your audience wants it or not, or what they want out of it. And that changed several times. And I think it was good, because the iterative process turned this into something that was widely applicable and of interest to students at all levels, and well, clearly enough to win an award there. I'm seeing some questions. I don't know at this point.
Carla, are you going to be dealing with the questions? Maybe before I'll just say something that at the end, Carla will show a link where we encourage people who have ideas about writing a case study, forward those ideas to us, and I will try to pair you with a potential faculty interested in that, because sometimes, especially this year with the COVID year, we haven't been able to meet like face to face. So your ideas, and you want to share your experiences, and that's going to be wonderful. But then the idea is to sort of pair you with a potential faculty that would be able to work with you in this process.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Will, Andrew, and Cesar, for your presentation. We are going to get started with the Q&A. People can continue to drop questions in the chat as we go. Getting started, someone has asked, how do we overcome the challenge of inadequate exhibits?
Inadequate exhibits that in the use of a case study or writing a case study. I mean, if it's writing a case study, well, you want to make sure that the exhibits are good enough and in the proper form. And for that, I mean, you should be using APA format, especially the 7th edition. And they talk about the way the figures and exhibits and everything it's used. In terms of using them, there are some questions, as I mentioned, in terms of the numbers that require you to look at data, and the data are usually in the exhibits. Many cases you have the narrative, and then at the end you have the exhibits. So it's up to you to use the data. And sometimes they don't tell you specifically, but of course, making the best use of exhibits to that information, which is in the appendix or exhibit. So it depends how you call it. To answer the questions and discuss the case, right? So it's up to the person that is using it to make the best use of the data, which is provided there in the appendix of the exhibits. I hope that answers the question.
Maybe I could add one other thing. In our case, we had 2 things. First, we had some exhibits that came from the time of when the actual case was going on. I still had some of those with me, but then where we didn't have exhibits, we created them. For example, we showed a snapshot of a relationship map. What our students kept telling us was that they didn't understand how the parties related, or that there were too many of them. So we made up a chart that explained how the parties were related in the case study. So it was a combination of using things that we already had available, but then we also added things in that were requested, and some of them needed to be created. For example, the relationship chart and a timeline that we did was very important, because if you go out and you research it, you get all kinds of things that happened over the 7 years that this case was in dispute. But we really only wanted them to focus on certain aspects of it. So we made our own timeline that helped focus attention and illustrate the points we were trying to get at.
And I think that speaks again to the test marketing that we did. That I know a lot of folks will say, maybe that was the question's intent, was that I don't have a lot of exhibits myself. Well, test it. And you'll find out, the market will tell you, the students will tell you, if you're teaching it yourself, if you have the faculty members teaching it, their students will tell them, hey, we needed this, we didn't get this. And there becomes your I guess your origin of exhibits comes really from what is needed to make the case successful in the classroom. So that's why the test marketing, and again, the availability of classes and students in a whole wide variety of ranges at ISM is unique. And again, I think that's something that makes this really a low-hanging fruit in so many ways for the community that's gathered here. Because we can teach this in so many different ways and really make those learnings consistent.
On that note of teaching it, can you hear me?
Another question, Carla?
Yes. Are you able to hear me? Oh, sorry. Hello?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. On that note of teaching it, the next question is, how did you guys decide on the target audience for the case?
Well, the target audience in this case, there were different levels. I used it for a course. I mean, a case study could have different target audiences, right? And that's a good example of our case. It could be an MBA course. It could be a doctoral seminar as well. It could be in a program, an MBA program. It could be in an executive program. So it's up to you, and also on the nature of the case. I mean, if we had, from the beginning, we wanted to make it, I think this was clear during the discussion, we wanted to make it available and usable. I mean, be able to be used by different audiences. So it does have a legal background, of course, because that is the nature of it, but we wanted to introduce elements of international business, also cultural management, because we were dealing with different approaches, international approaches to the insurance sector, right? There was the Swiss company, there was the American public, there was also an issue with such a tragic event that hit the whole world. There were also political issues involved, so the case could be used in different settings, right? So it is up to you to decide, the more settings that it could be used, the better, but at least you have to be aware of which ones are those and how you can adapt it to the different audiences, right?
Well, and if I could go back to a point I made earlier, I think it was, and I'm not going to take any credit for this. It's just to move the process along. Somebody's got to step up and say, this is where we're at least going to test it the first time.
Correct.
And I was teaching our International Business Environments course, which is a core course in our Executive MBA program, again, at the University of Akron. I've taught that class for many years. There's nobody there who's international per se. There's nobody there who's looking to study international business. Again, it's a survey course in our core curriculum. I just took it upon myself to say, okay, we have this content now. Let me see how it's going to work with general executive MBA students, really from a negotiation perspective, which then takes the elements of culture, of geopolitical, political economy, of risk, of insurance, of finance, et cetera, et cetera. It puts all of that into that basket. In the end, though, the real focus was, let's make this an international negotiation case. And I just did it. And I think that again, not me, I think the fact that we got to that point where we had enough content to make that happen, and we learned then, and it wasn't a perfect execution, of course, in that first class that was taught, Yet we had enough understanding that's saying, okay, this seems like the way to go forward. Had that blown up, I would have probably I'm sure I would have come back to Will and Cesar and said, hey guys, didn't seem to work here. Let's maybe tweak this a little bit. So I guess the bigger answer is get the content, make a relatively informed guess about where you think this is going to, have some traction, test market it there, and then learn, and then iterate along those lines. And then again, we were incredibly fortunate that we were able to teach this case 6 more times in 6 different settings. So now we can sit here all this time later and say, yes, it goes into these baskets.
Correct.
The case, we didn't know that. And it was only because we were able to test it all those times that made that possible.
Sure.
Yeah. I think, Andrew, you spoke a little bit about how the community and the fact that this evolved at ISM allowed you to teach it in many different places. But we have a question from Conrad about how you promote the case once it's published to ensure that it gets maximum exposure to professors.
Well, there are 2 things. The way we did it was, we published, the outlet was the Case Center. And of course, it's very commonly used by professors at various universities, business schools all over the world. Ever since I started using case studies or publishing, I would say about 20 years ago, the Case Center is the key outlet where you go looking for cases, right? So then there are some awards, and some cases that get those awards get reference in a higher place, right? So they're easier to access. That's from the point of view of the publisher, but also internally, and then for the ISM community, and thanks to Carla as well, we publicized and did communications on the publication of this case. And also when we got the award, then that got more attention, of course. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think this is how we actually did it, in terms of the outlet where we published, the Case Center, and then internally, organically within the ISM community.
Yeah, so if I could add to that, there's a couple things. The Case Center or the other publishers of cases, they make their money by selling the case to other people. So
Sure.
They do marketing for you. And if you go on the Case Center and you look for our case, you'll see that they've done a write-up, and this gets circulated to their mailing lists. And I also told my contacts about it, and the school did a good job of promoting it. But your publisher will take on a lot of that role. And since this is a new priority at ISM, certainly the ISM people will flag your achievement and the case and make it available to others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true that we didn't mention that, but of course, when you go to the Case Center, you can get a subscription, like institutional subscription or individual subscription. But to get access to a case and to the teaching note, that you have to pay. There is a fee that you have to pay. Okay.
So I think the next question we can give to Will. How do you deal with confidentiality? How do you deal with confidentiality in the case of a real life situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. The fastest, easiest answer is you go to your company and you ask them first if it's all right, if you can use this story. And a lot of times, they'll say okay if it puts them in a good light, or at least it's objective. If not, then you have to anonymize it. But I'll tell you that the publishers like to use real company names, real people to make it relatable. And when you go through the publishing process and you submit it online, one of the things they ask you about is, well, who are the protagonists? Who are the entities involved? Do you have clearances from them to speak about this? Or are you speaking about general knowledge? We kind of had a mix of general knowledge and requiring company permission. And so, I wrote to him and explained to him what the situation was. And of course, I first went to somebody that I knew and said, well, can you do this? And they were okay with it. But if you can't, then you have to anonymize it a little bit. and change the name and say that it's been done. The names have been changed, but it's based upon an actual story. But yeah, you cannot do it without permission or knowledge of the people or the companies that you're writing about.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that answers the question that we had from Olivia about the
maybe
legal
talking about
perspective.
fees again. I mentioned that the case center. Okay, no, I just wanted to add something before we move on to the next question about the fees. To be able to publish in the case center, you don't have to pay anything. It's just the case that gets chosen by them, right? It is the people that access and purchase cases after that they want to use them for class setting or other purposes, that they would actually pay to have access to each case. But for you to publish it, like in our case, you don't have to pay anything. It just gets through a review process, right? But you don't have to pay anything.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Our next question is, what approach was appropriate in this case? Narrative, ethnographic, or grounded theory?
Professors?
It's narrative.
Andrew, I can say that cases are,
it was narrative.
More. Yeah, you want to answer that, Andrew?
Yeah, it was narrative. It was a compelling story.
Narrative.
It was a compelling story of an individual.
Right.
As part of we're not telling the story of the war. We're telling the story of the squad. It's the Saving Private Ryan mindset. That's kind of how I saw this from the very beginning.
Right.
A lot of people knew a lot about 9/11. We're going to tell a very small portion of what went on in the background that was really compelling. And so it was narrative. And if you take a look at the case, and I maybe Cesar could share that with the community or Carla or whomever later on, I don't know what that would all mean. You'd see very clearly there was narrative. And frankly, I think most cases that do well, if you do a market analysis of the cases that sell well, they tend to be much more on the narrative side of things.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally.
Okay. Somebody, just in terms of the process, Felipe is asking, how did you document the use of the case 3 times for the publisher?
I can take this if you want. So yeah, Felipe, what you do is when you submit your case, the case center is really good about this. They have an online case submission process.
Correct.
And you go through it. You put in information about your case, but then they also ask you questions about where have you taught it, when have you taught it, and there's specific lines, and you have to there are drop down boxes where you put in the name of the institution, then you fill in the name of the class, you tell them how many students there were. And so they do that. Now, I assume in the background, they check up and verify those things, but they ask you for it. We also provided write-ups. So because Andrew, Cesar, and I were all in 3 different parts of the world while we were doing this, every time we taught the case, we wrote a note about what happened in the case, how it was received, things that we could improve. We shared that with each other. And then when we submitted the case, we also sent some of those write-ups to the publisher along with it. But yeah, they do check. So there's a specific process there, Philippe.
Right. I would say that this is the upstream thing, but then downstream, when you write the teaching note, you should provide your experience depending on the setting. Let's say if it's an MBA course, or if it's a graduate course, or doctorate course, or if it's an international business or international law or something like that. So you have to provide that in the teaching note, how the experience was in different settings.
And we did this in 2 different versions, by the way. We did the face-to-face, and then because of COVID, we did an online version of this. And we wrote that up. In fact, the publisher said that was really helpful, that you also had the online version, because that's what's in demand right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's a different dynamic. You'll see it when you teach your classes. It's a different dynamic, and you have to adapt the case. And if you have you have a case that's malleable and there's that can be adapted, you'll find that it works easier. It's worked well on the on Zoom, my students were pretty good about it. But, for me, I personally like getting in the classroom and watching them argue and yell at each other. And that's fun. It's just a little bit different. And so you need to know, who's your audience. Your audience is right now is probably teachers that are sitting in their basement trying to teach a class. So keep that in mind and help them, because that also helps sell your case. Help them understand, well, this is how we've used it in the past, and here's the way you might use it based upon our experience.
That online experience is important. Yeah.
Great. Thank you guys so much. Does anybody else have any other questions that they'd like to add before we wrap up? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Will, Cesar, and Andrew, for sharing with us and walking us through this. Cesar, maybe you can speak a bit to the proposals and
yes. So, this is the first of a series that we want to do at ISM. Definitely is, we need to document that remarkable experience that our community has. And when you talk to people, you realize that they have such interesting backgrounds and they work in such interesting contexts, that there's so much information that needs to be shared with the community and beyond. So what we are targeting here is, a series of different cases. That was the first. And if you have any ideas, proposals, please send it to us through this link. And as I said earlier, we'll try to work on that to pair you with one faculty, because as was mentioned from the beginning, this sort of like a teamwork between a faculty member and the student that is willing to share this experience is key to the success of writing and publishing a case study. So just write that down, your ideas, and we'll be taking them very seriously to help you out in the process of elaborating and publishing case studies as a major contribution to the community and beyond, because the case studies are published to be used by the large community of business schools, universities, researchers, and practitioners as well. So we look forward to receiving those ideas from you, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. It was really great to have you. I see some feedback in the chat. And the recording of this webinar is going to be made available and sent to you in the next few days.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Carla, and everyone who participated. Bye.